we're talking about climate change today. Every week, actually every day, if you follow the news, there's something else more depressing about how the scientists have actually been more conservative than they should be in terms of the impacts of climate change. And we don't talk a lot about the impacts. You know, we talk about it's getting warm, it's getting unpleasant. Some people are going to have to migrate in the future. You know, chronic asthma is the fastest growing issue affecting children in cities. Cancer in cities is being linked to greenhouse gas emissions, CO2. And you see a lot of similarities between what happened in the tobacco industry and in the auto industry and the fossil fuel industry. And so that, I think, can be helpful in figuring out where we're going with automobiles. This is a really interesting visual to me. This is Beijing in 2008, and the government decided, quick policy shift, hey, we're going to shut down factories, power plants, and we're going to ask people not to drive for 12 days, intermittently, so that people actually be able to breathe during the Olympics. And you can visually see the stark difference with the government's policies, albeit short term. And what's interesting is transportation, which we've always known as a piece of the puzzle, as of February of this year, is the first time in 35 years that actually transportation is the #1 polluter. And that's airplanes, buses, cars, a lot of single occupancy vehicles. The other thing that motivates me is that I think our frame of reference is broken. I heard this in some of the earlier presentations too. I think somebody was talking about our baseline. Well, we consider this normal. This is how many people die on the world's roads every year. It's the #1 killer of young people. It's not Zika virus, as you would think if you watch the news. And in the US, what's interesting is as you have gas get cheaper, as it did last year, and highways are free and parking's pretty cheap, guess what happens? People drive more. And we see more death on our roads. Let's look at history for a minute. We think of the modern city as modern. Again, that's our frame of reference. The average age in here is probably 50 to 60 years old. We've seen a certain sort of way of life in our lifetimes. But the reality is, if you go way back 5,000, 10,000 years, cities have not changed that much. The way that we do things, the way we move, you know, now we may drive or get on a bus, and back then we may have ridden on a horse or walked. But basically, what we found through study is that the modern city, which disproportionately gets more productive as you infill and it gets more dense, there's more energy created amongst people. We've studied looking at artifacts and realized that ancient societies were the exact same way. So there's something to density. Going back in history, so we've been on the Earth 200,000 years. The asteroid hitting the Earth was referenced earlier. We're basically here by accident. And in 116 years, we've gone from 2 billion people to 7 billion people, a 350% increase, I think, on our way to 9 billion. So if we continue to consume at the same rates, it's sort of obvious what's going to happen to us. Now let's go back, but to a more modern time. Let's go back just 110 years ago. And let's look at what urban streets look like. Before the invention of the combustion engine and the automobile really starting to take over our streets, people ruled the streets. This is a picture actually of Seattle. And there's a store there, H. Hirschberg and Company, I'm guessing a clothing store. You don't have to be an economist or a sociologist or a business person like I am to figure out that this store is probably really busy. There's a lot of people on the streets. Politicians refer to congestion problems. We've got to figure out what to do about congestion. Congestion used to be a good thing when it wasn't single occupancy vehicles spewing out fumes. This is my hometown now of Washington, D.C. And you can see that we had a very balanced system around the turn of the last century. A lot of biking, walking, streetcars, high-capacity transit, and some cars being introduced into the system. Many of you know the history. Eisenhower, $25 billion, Federal Highway Act. It was called the Interstate Defense Act as well. And the idea was connect our cities, connect our states, facilitate interstate commerce. Wonderful goals, but the problem is we thought, hey, this is working so well, let's sort of socially engineer society, and let's just drive these things right through the cities. And this is Robert Moses and the Crosstown Bronx Expressway, but every major city and a lot of minor cities, you see where we tore the heart and soul out of the city. We segregated our cities, and we destroyed, obviously, real estate value and culture in our cities. And then we invented or socially engineered these suburbs. And I love using the term socially engineered because people talk about like bike lanes that I've built and other things that I've done. And they're like, why are you trying to socially engineer things? And I'm like, I'm just trying to unengineer what the companies and the government did back in the 1950s. But you know, by pushing people out to the suburbs and leaving the jobs downtown, we created this cultural divide, which I think we saw last Tuesday. You know, this is connected. Our land use is connected to our culture. And we basically pushed people out to the suburbs. We left some people in the cities, and we abandoned them there. But we marketed people with means. We marketed the American dream, which looks idyllic except for all the machines everywhere. And I actually work with Bill Ford at Fontanales Partners, and he'll tell you the single occupancy vehicle is not the future of transportation. And we made some tremendous mistakes in our planning in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And as we did this, we started to sell people more depreciating assets than appreciating assets, which affected a lot of things in their lives. And there's a direct correlation to the number of cars that we sold them that went out on the road and the number of fatalities. Direct correlation. And not everyone benefited. There were a lot of people left in the cities, and Detroit's a great example, but you can look at every American city, including Boston. This is Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, where we drove I-75, and I say we as the collective we back then, drove I-75 through Detroit, took out 350 black-owned businesses, and again, sort of socially engineered this change. And you can see the change in the way things looked and the interstate being put in Tiger Stadium. And obviously, we bored out the center of the city. And the population dropped like a stone. The other thing that we did is we got rid of the streetcars in every American city. And this is the way that people got around between neighborhoods, right? And so we drove the highways through and disbanded the transit system. And Detroit is one example. There's many others. But you can literally look to the month that we either drove the big highway through or shut down the streetcar system and just watch people flee. And it was called white flight. A lot of black folks left too, by the way, if they had means. Again, looking at history in our frame of reference, let's look at parking. So in 1870, the Congress passed a law that Washington, D.C. could take up to half of their space on the street, or at least half of the space, and use it for park space. So it was meant to be used for shrubs and bushes and trees. And then people started tying up their horses and putting their cars in between the trees, and before you know it, it was park meant to park your vehicle. And now we've got over 500 million spaces. This is a conservative estimate. Some people say up to 2 billion spaces to park and store cars. So what's very interesting is we have an affordable housing crisis, right, which we could very easily change. The average two-bedroom apartment, by my research, is $800 a month in the US. And when you add underground parking, it takes it to $1,200 a month. So that's a 62.5% increase, on top of the fact that AAA estimates a car costs $800 to $900 a month. So using transit and Zipcar, I was an executive at a Boston-based company, Zipcar, back in the day, and on average, people would spend $200 a month if they used transit, Zipcar, walking, and biking. So you spend $800 to $900 plus the parking space, suddenly you're at $2,200 a month instead of $1,000 a month. That's how you create an affordable housing crisis.